Today we're going to talk about the B17 Nine-oh-Nine crash in the Northeast in Connecticut last October. It was a real tragedy with terrible repercussions and an incredible chain of events, so stick with us on FlyWire. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire we're going to unpack the crash of the B17 Nine-oh-Nine at Windsor Locks, Bradley Airport in Connecticut in October 2019. The factual NTSB report has been released. It's 1,240 pages long. It took me several days to wade through it. And the accident chain was very long and incredibly frustrating when you look at this accident and the many critical mistakes that were made along the way. I haven't watched the other YouTube videos out there on this accident. There's a lot of people looking at it, so I don't really know their take on it. But from my perspective, the B-17 almost made it. It was never going to be pretty or textbook, but one critical decision made the difference between life and death. And of course, I'm going to save that until the end. Okay, so you got to watch the whole thing. So let's begin talking about culture. Remember, accidents happen with a chain of events leading to the end, to the accident itself. And this is a Jacob Marley chain. This is just me talking, but from my perspective, you cannot use legislation as coercion. When people are involved, hey, they just don't tend to react the way you tell them to. There has to be a reason that resonates with them to influence their behavior. So I say this because the FAA has instituted strict limitations on folks who want to do living history flight experiences. That's what this airplane was operated under. It's a combat airplane from World War II and not designed for passengers. In order to charge money to fly on a warbird like this B-17 Flying Fortress, you have rules to follow, period. You have to operate. They tell you how you operate. They tell you how you maintain the airplane, how you train to fly the airplane, a whole slew of things that put it in black and white, okay? Within the last few years, another wrinkle was added to the letter of authorization to do living history experience rides, and that was the safety management system. All of these things are good ideas. I'm not saying they shouldn't exist. In this case, guidance is a good thing. The problem is the culture. How do you implement that so everybody has buy-in? Okay, and that's the important part. What I'm saying is that safety programs tend to have an initial positive impact and then they taper off in their effectiveness. The average accident rate per 100,000 hours in GA was 7.97 overall and 2.36 for fatalities during the years 2001 to 2005. An emphasis on aviation safety, that's easy for you to say, began pulling that down to 3.5 in 2016 and the fatal rate down 0.93, which is pretty good. And in 2018, however, that trend is reversed. The numbers are still out for 2019, but it sure looks like 2020 has been a bad year so far. We're going to see. Unfortunately, it takes a while for them to compile numbers. By way of comparison, the overall Air Force, U.S. Air Force rate was 1.04 when I retired in 2000. And in 2019, it was 1.51. To be honest, the fighter accident rate has been creeping up significantly in recent years, and I have my own opinions about that. But to a large extent, safety has become part of the culture in the Air Force, and there are certain MDSs where it hasn't had a problem. I mean, it's virtually zero for an accident rate. It just hasn't gotten that kind of emphasis or acceptance in the GA world. To really affect safety in the long term, it has to be a part of a cultural change. It has to be ingrained into how you operate on a daily basis. To be frank, crew dogs have to want to do it. There has to be buy-in. And this B-17 accident is a perfect example of no buy-in on any level. Before you go off on the operator of the B-17, let's take a look at the FAA. They're supposed to monitor the operator and have a POC assigned. It's part of their rules. And the Orlando FFISDO, that's where it was based, that foundation was based, they had a POC, and then he left, and he wasn't replaced. The foundation was told to submit their emails to a general email box, in which they did, and they were promptly ignored. Eventually, they just stopped sending notices. And when interviewed for the investigation, the accident investigation, the FSDO manager down there had no clue as to anything related to the accident, the foundation operations, or anything leading up to it. But they were Johnny on the spot trying to clean up the mess. Their disinterest is part of the cultural problem. The foundation itself paid lip service to the safety program. They had one, sorta. This sorta attitude slipped into their training program, and they only trained new guys on relocation flights when the airplane couldn't carry paying passengers anyway. There are reasons they do this, and that's one of the rules that says you can't do that with passengers. There are reasons they do this, and for one, a big reason is flying these airplanes is really expensive. I'm not denying that. So dedicated training missions get less priority. What this breeds is a tendency to fill squares. After a while, the square gets filled without even real training getting done. Everyone suffers, and as an example of the training issues, this pilot in this accident was not a CFI MEI, and yet he gave the co-pilot that was flying with that day his training and his SIC rating in the B-17. He served as a check airman in the B-17 without being qualified to do so. How did that happen? I don't know. How did that happen? I don't want to make this video all about the holes in the cheese that this accident flew through. Suffice it to say that the problems began at the top. Unfortunately, they didn't stop there. The airborne portion of this accident took 5 minutes, but the proximate cause took 40 minutes before takeoff. The pilot, known by everyone as Mac, was also the chief mechanic for the foundation as well as the B-17. And he had been chasing a mag issue on number 4 engine for quite a while. Number 3 was also having some problems, but 4 was the worst, apparently. During the investigation teardown, it was found, of the engine and the mags and the props, it was found that both number 4 mags were worn out of most tolerances. They were dirty and had trouble producing spark. Number 3 was about the same, with one mag that was even intermittent and unreliable. Several of the mags showed corrosion due to water. Moisture was a problem, so much so that Mac had developed a technique to blow out the mags with nitrogen to get the engine started. Number 3 even had a homemade hose that made it easy to access the gear in the gear well. You had to climb pretty high to get to that engine. It was important to note that this is not an authorized maintenance procedure. It's homemade. After a couple of attempts with nitrogen on that day, they finally succeeded in starting the engines, and then they taxied out for takeoff. The flight crew, or the flight engineer, the crew chief / loadmaster, he had not had any formal training in operating the B-17 or the ride program. He was charged with doing the passenger safety briefing, and during his interview, he admits that he had no training or even examples given. They just kind of told him what you should say. Surviving passengers testified that they never got any instruction on any of the safety belts, the exits, anything except where to sit. Oh, and don't tighten your seat belts because it makes them hard to release. The crew chief, by the way, he did not have a seat. He stood between the pilot and the co-pilot most of the time. And the pilots, and he said the pilots never used their shoulder harnesses. Given how these guys, the injuries they received, I think the shoulder harnesses might have made a difference. The airplane taxied out from the FBO down runway 33 to their intersecting runways. Looks like kind of a T, not quite, to the active runway 6. The pilot requested, and he made an intersection takeoff with approximately 6,000 feet remaining. There is nothing inherently wrong about an intersection takeoff, especially if you're in a stall airplane. But a big, heavy 4-engine World War II bomber with a lot of people and gas on board, you know, it might be a better idea to use all available runway. If nothing else, it's a clear way in case you have a problem. There's no obstacles on that long runway. An interesting divergence occurs with a few of the surviving passengers and the crew chief's testimony after the accident. He was the only survivor of the crew. The crew chief claims that they did a regular run-up and the airplane was good to go. But 2 of the passengers, one of whom was an experienced Air Force C-130 crew chief, said they taxied out very quickly after they got the engine started and took off without any revving of the engines. One wonders how cold those engines were and the oil and the props were. You didn't exercise the props either. Clearly, this pilot was in a hurry. He was impatient. So let's go through the takeoff sequence event, the takeoff and flight by events in time. Okay. Once airborne, and the gear is in the wells, the crew chief gets the passengers up to explore the airplane in flight. He goes back to the cockpit after he told the people in the back they could walk around to see a problem, okay? And then he quickly went and reseated all the passengers in the front and the back, and then came back to the cockpit. An engineer during the investigation used the ADS-B data to deduce the takeoff and climb power was equal to 3.5 engines. At 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the flight, they were switched to departure. At 2 minutes 24 into the flight, there was a sudden drop to 2 engines producing takeoff power. This is the computation in the report. At 2 minutes 33, they checked in with departure, standby 1 please. At 3 minutes 13, they checked in with departure again, and they said they requested a return to the field. They did not declare an emergency, either now or at any other time. And I think that is a critical mistake. At 3 minutes 20, the co-pilot radios to departure that they would like to return to the field immediately. And the peak speed occurred just a bit prior to this, and that was about 124 miles an hour. Shortly after this radio call, the speed decayed to 98 miles an hour. And at 3 minutes 24, the controller asked if they needed assistance, and the reply was negative. The controller asked the reason why they're returning, and the reply was a rough mag on number 4. The next few transmissions were about jet traffic that the B-17 would interfere with. Remember, no emergency call, no priority. The controller was accommodating and eventually cleared them to proceed however they wanted to runway 6. So let's jump back to 2 minutes 24 seconds into the flight. The crew chief had just returned to the cockpit, and the engine on the right side was running rough. The pilot said, "I'm going to cage number 4," and he reached up and feathered the prop. The B-17 Military-1 is a little vague on this procedure, the whole thing, but the one I'm familiar with big radials and World War II bombers, is identify, verify using the other crew member, and then it's failed throttle idle, failed prop full decrease, failed mixture idle cutoff, failed engine, feather button, depress. The only thing that was accomplished of this whole list there was the feather button. The mixture was found where it was still full, and the prop was up, and the throttle as well. So the important step, though, of all of those things that just happened, the important step missing here is no coordination with the crew and no attempt to verify that 4 was indeed the failing engine. The pilot made the assumption that 4 was the problem because he was used to dealing with this troublesome mag. He expected that to be the issue. He knew it was the issue. The trouble is, it wasn't the issue. Remember the derived performance data. The airplane was experiencing 3.5 engines worth of power. That loss was due to number 3 and not number 4. During the engine teardown, it was found that number 3 had begun experiencing severe detonation, and the result was a severe loss of thrust. This loss of thrust progressed throughout the flight, all the way to on the ground. One witness reported seeing the airplane fly over with the number 4 prop stopped, and he could see the blades turning on number 3, but he couldn't see the prop blades on the left engine. They were running. After the fact, we now know that number 3 was the failed engine. And when the pilot pushed the feather button on number 4, he created a 2-engine out scenario. So I'm going to show you some pictures here that's going to detail the altitude above sea level and the flight path of the airplane, okay? The ground at runway 6 is 173 feet, so the highest altitude actually achieved is 764 feet above sea level, and that's actually about 600 feet AGL-ish. An attempt was to climb was made at 400 to 400 AGL, because with that engine problem right away, then speed bled off to approximately 95 miles an hour. I think that's where the gear was extended. But from this point on, a steady descent began with rates between 700 feet per minute to 160 feet per minute, all the way to 80 feet AGL, right there at the runway. Speed was a problem for the rest of the flight. During the investigation, it was revealed that a 2-engine out situation would require a minimum of 145 miles an hour to maintain level flight, and up to 190 miles an hour with the gear out. What is important here is VMC. You might remember that from a previous video I've talked about, velocity min control. Remember in my B-25 engine out video, I mentioned that VMC was not a World War II era concept, but nevertheless, it is a real thing. Losing one engine on a 4-engine airplane is not a huge deal. Losing 2 on one side can be catastrophic. To counteract that loss of power, you need copious amounts of rudder into the good engine, and you need to keep that wing high, like they said in World War II, keep that wing high. The result is considerable side slip and a huge increase in drag. Big airplane, lots of drag. The drag due to side slip is a factor in any multi-engine scenario or any airplane, but don't forget this is a really big airplane. The drag was enormous. The slower you fly, the less power you can use. Don't have the flight control authority. Keep this one in mind because I think it's going to be really important here in a minute. So somewhere in here, the pilot commands the co-pilot to lower the gear. Sort on downwind, not quite. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why he lowered the gear so quick. If he intended to land on runway 33, and I'm going to point it out right here, that you can see in this picture that it would have worked out well. It would have been high in altitude, but that's okay to have energy. And if they declared an emergency, they could have landed in any runway they wanted to. The winds were calm, so that wasn't a factor. When they put their gear down this early, their fate was sealed. They just didn't have enough power available to stay in the air at the airspeed they were flying. They had to trade altitude for airspeed, and they didn't have a lot of altitude to begin with. Following the rest of their flight path, they stayed in the descent and cleared the final tree line barely 100 feet in the air in a right-hand turn. The surprise is they actually ended up almost lined up with the runway, but so low that they clipped the runway lights. After striking the runway lights, the airplane lost 13 miles per hour in 10 seconds. That's what the engineer's report said. And his performance analysis concluded that put the right wing very close to the stall, if not at the stall. And it was still in a right turn. And this is likely because the speed was so low and the left engine still had power on, left engines had the power set and they hadn't changed. Approaching VMC or below it, the airplane's going to begin rolling to the right and the right turning to the right. And the right tire touches down and it's followed shortly by the right wingtip. Okay, the airplane keeps going to the right, and the witness got this video I'm going to show you here, and I'm going to shut up for a second. Okay, you can tell that power is up on to nearly max as it goes by the camera. Witnesses corroborate this, and they said the engines went to high power after the wingtip touched the ground and stayed that way until impact. Why was the power pushed up? To go around? To get energy back in the airplane? A human reaction to danger without thinking of the consequence? Whatever the reason, it made the crash worse by putting more energy into the airplane before that sudden stop. You know, I'm trying to get my arms around this turn of events. In my view, you know, the critical decision actually that made the difference between life and death is right here. They were almost lined up on the runway, and if all the others were pretty egregious, but this is the one that was the critical one. If they had pull power, when they hit the runway lights, they would have been able to straighten the flight path out, and the landing would have been ugly, and the airplane most likely destroyed, but with the runway and the cleared area on either side of it, they were very likely they would have been able to stop without hitting anything else and then walk away. But that didn't happen. Landing on runway 33 didn't happen. And you gotta ask yourself why. Of course, this part here, the asking yourself why, is Monday morning quarterbacking. I don't have any proof. I don't have anything to go on, except I know how people react. The crew chief, his testimony isn't good enough to fill in the blanks of what went on in the cockpit. His essay was low. There's no cockpit voice recorder, and we don't know, we don't know what happened, but, we do know what happened. We don't know what happened in the cockpit to create those events. And that brings us back to culture, where we started. I think the reason the pilot would not declare the emergency was a perception of a black mark. He had dealt with engine problems before, and it was not a big deal. He didn't need input from the crew. They didn't know anything anyway. He was the guy. He was the man. He was the B-17 guy. He knew what the problem was, and he didn't use crew resource management. Okay, he made a bunch of rash decisions that ended horribly wrong. And as experienced as he was, his situational awareness was low. And I think the important lesson learned is that can happen to any one of us at any time if we aren't working on it. If we don't accept that, our SA is low and we got to build it, we might end up in a similar situation. So what can we learn from this? If you watch my videos, you'll know that I favor regular dedicated training. I like training. Even by myself, I like to train. I like to practice things. I do not favor any checkout flights on a cross country. You know, there are some things you can do, but in general, the maneuvers you need to do are incompatible with a cross country. Flying with another pilot, even in single engine, bring them into the loop. Another pair of engaged eyes can make the difference, all the difference, in a tight spot. Don't be in a rush to do anything. Make sure you're doing the right thing. Remember that old adage, wind your watch? Make sure you're doing the right thing to the right engine, especially in a multi. Only in a multi. In this situation, I would not have shut any engine down, okay? I would have gone to the idle to check which was the bad engine, but if it produced power at all, so be it. Push it up. At 400 AGL, I need power. I feel the need for speed. Don't forget, speed is life, to paraphrase a silly TV, movie. The engine's contribution to all of this is to get us, me, the airplane, back on the ground with minimal descent rate on a flat, clear landing area. And the engine can be replaced. Even if it's expensive, losing a life is a much worse outcome, period. Safety first means surviving. I hope we can all learn from this tragedy. I hope those lessons will save the Living History Flight Experience program. I think it's really an amazing experience, and folks need to share it. They need to see. I could go on, and you probably don't want to hear that. But if you like the video, please hit like and subscribe. You know, it looks like something like this, and you can find it down there. Up here, these are my Patreon supporters. They make this video possible. So thank you, I appreciate that. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's a link down below. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on FlyWire. Click this link for the latest upload. Click this link for whatever YouTube thinks you ought to watch. Or you can click this link to subscribe. Thanks for watching.